I'd like, first of all, just to welcome you to this IAGA-sponsored panel at ICE. The panel is adapting to change in Europe. So I think, just to set the scene, Wes has been quoted as saying, we felt that there should be a competitive mechanism by which pan-European companies can obtain pan-European licenses for online exploitation. Now, that was probably a hope that Wes expressed either after a very good night in the bar or alternatively after taking some seriously mind-altering drugs. Wes, would you like to comment on that? And that was clearly a pipe dream. Where do you think we are now?
Well, you know, my belief is you have to set the bar high. And I think ultimately for this industry, what they would like to see is to be able to operate freely across borders. I think, just so I can tell you sort of where potential bubbling points are in regards to that aspiration. One is just to close off the issue of the European Union, because I think there's always a hope shared by many that the European Union is going to somehow be the silver bullet which finally eradicates these individual licensing systems, or for many in the industry, even worse, the countries that have prohibitions. Let me just tell you what's going on very quickly, which is there are mainly two main thrusts at the European level. One is in the European Commission with the famous Green Paper, which I'm sure all of you will read when it's fully published, as we expect at the end of first quarter of this year. That is meant to begin a discussion, but I'm going to dilute the possibilities of that by saying it is going to initiate a discussion, but not necessarily lead to anything more substantial. The second issue is the member states themselves at the political level. I'm not talking about the regulators, but I'm talking about the ministry officials have been discussing gambling for about 3.5 years now. And this group is beginning to form a unified opinion on various aspects of online gambling. An obvious one is enforcement. And these are two areas to watch out for, but watch out for in the long term.
Andre, I think you take the view that the European position, the European Green Paper, is too Eurocentric, but isn't that an essential nature of a European Green Paper?
I've been keeping an eye on Europe now for the last year or two, and I still don't understand really what's going on there. It's extremely complicated, and I can imagine that many people sitting here find it quite hard and quite difficult to make out where Europe is actually going. However, having said that, I think you are right, and I am concerned that Europe is very much going down the route of ignoring what's happening in the rest of the world. And there have been interesting developments, lessons that have been learned. To be honest with you, just this morning, the International Association of Gaming Regulators, under the chairmanship of Jenny, met, where we've talked about things such as common standards, where we've talked about lessons learned, about you know, how do we report, how do we interact with our licensees, testing, certification, and those sort of things. Whereas those things are currently happening, you see European countries often speeding ahead with a view to solve an income problem or a lack of income, you know, to introduce gambling, but not necessarily looking, you know, to what's happened in the rest of the world, the lessons that have been learned there. So it is certainly a concern that I have.
Well, we'll certainly come on to cooperation between regulators. I would like to ask Jenny, first of all, because I know everybody in the room is dying to know, what's going to happen in the UK, Jenny?
Well, as you know, I agreed to do this panel because I was absolutely certain that by now the UK government would have said what it was going to do. So when I go on to speculate, you'll see how good I am at forecasting. The government, there have been consultation proposals to move to a system of licensing, or to move from our present system where we license at the point of supply. So we recognise European licenses and whitelisted jurisdiction licenses, and the proposal is to move to a domestic licensing system. So anybody targeting Great Britain will need a license from us. So that's the proposal. We will try to cooperate as much as possible with the other jurisdictions. So we do not want to duplicate anything anybody else has done. So we will want to use the material, compliance, enforcement, licensing material from the other jurisdictions, have agreements with them to share material. We won't require any equipment or staff necessarily in Great Britain if we're satisfied that we have sufficient access and sufficient leverage on the operator where they are. So it may be that if they're in some very far away place where we don't know very much about what happens there, then we will require mirror servers or something like that in Great Britain. But if they're in a place that we know well, we know the regulator, we know the way they do their work, then we'll be perfectly happy for them to be in that jurisdiction. We can either go there for audits or what have you, or we hope rely on the, as it were, the home regulator to do them and just show us the homework. As I say, we don't really want to duplicate. So I don't see that this move will necessarily add greatly to the regulatory burden of operators, provided we can get that level of cooperation and agreement about common approaches from the other regulators. So I very much agree with Wes. I think this is actually going to be built up in a sense from the ground upwards, which was actually the pattern really, I think it'd be fair to say, on money laundering. I mean, it took about 14 years, I think, didn't it, to move from a degree of cooperation to actually international law. But it's a very similar sort of process. I think we're making some progress on that.
Tim, coming to you representing operators, what is your view about the consequences? Additional cost, additional problems with regulation in numerous different jurisdictions?
Well, it's a huge burden, clearly, going forward. I was talking this morning about the future of European regulation, and clearly we are looking down the barrel of 27 different member states, all regulating entirely separately. Now, you know, as Jenny, I know, is pushing, I think the idea that regulators start to work together to come to some kind of mutual agreement on a set of standards or some way of being able to recognise operators that have passed the test in one country and another country, I think is an excellent step forward. I think, though, that, you know, stepping back a bit, I think we have to be very realistic about regulation of online gambling, and, you know, frankly, we have to be realistic in the context of the internet and how fast the internet has developed, and how fast, you know, and basically how legislation has lagged behind. And it's not just in the online gambling space. You know, we can look at legislation and regulation in a number of other different online sectors. So my view is, you know, this is an intensely political area. It's very clear through numerous court decisions from the European Court of Justice and various infringement proceedings that have come out of the European Commission. It's very clear that there is no clear black or white in regards to the regulation of online gambling throughout Europe. The reality is consumers don't particularly care. They do this activity anyway. They go and play these games whether we like it or not. And the sooner that governments and regulators, you know, understand, and I mean, this is an activity that is happening, and isn't it better to regulate it, to control it, to make sure that as many consumers as possible are protected from underage gambling and problem gambling and so on, that there's money laundering protections in place, and this activity is taxed? Isn't that better than trying to brush it under the carpet and pretend it doesn't exist?